mind that I
Good afternoon and welcome to this month's community webinar with Thirst. As you know, we are joined by another fantastic guest every single month, and today is no exception. Today we are joined by Clark Quinn. As you all know by now, I'm terrible at introducing people, but for once, I feel like I really don't need to. But if on the off chance that you're here with no idea of who this gentleman is beside me, Clark, could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do, your background in the industry?
Oh, goodness. So I'm Clark Quinn. I'm Executive Director of Quinnovation. I'm also the co-director of the Learning Development Accelerator, a small evidence-based society for evidence-based L&D. And I'm a board advisor to Elevator 9 for learning science. My background briefly saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate. It's essentially been my career ever since. Strange twists and turns. Went back to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. Did the academic route for a while, came back to the corporate world, have been a consultant for the past quarter century. My main focus is taking what we know about how our brains work, how we think, work, and learn, and applying that to our organizational learning situations in any, not-for-profit, government, higher ed, K-12, but better aligning because we really aren't doing a good job of that.
Fantastic. That was a wonderfully brief. That was very much sticking to the brief there to give a brief overview. Fantastic. So thank you all for joining us. I can see lots of you pouring in now. Please do jump into the comments. Let us know kind of what your work situation is at the moment and what you're looking to get out of this session. As always, we've got stuff that we want to talk about, but this is your hour. So if you've got burning questions around the practical application of learning science, please do get them in the comments and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. But to get the ball rolling, I guess probably the biggest question we should try and address right from the start of this session is why understanding learning science is so important to us working in corporate L&D. It's often, very much touted in the academic space, but why is it important to us, do you think?
A couple reasons, actually. And I feel obliged to mention that really that includes the cognitive science as well. Historically, a number of people were looking at the mind, psychologists, linguists, philosophers, neuroscientists, and the recognition grew that they were all doing stuff on their own and they needed to find a way to crosstalk. So they created the Cognitive Science Society roughly around the 1980s. I happened to be a grad student in the department that really was causing this to happen. My PhD advisor was a major instigator. And that same thing happened, so they started talking about learning, the brain and thinking, and they realized learning was a fundamental aspect. And there were educational psychologists and behavioral psychologists and a bunch who were also talking about learning. And again, they didn't have a way to talk about it. So they created the learning sciences community in the 90s. And I think both of these are critical because if you talk about how we think, work, and learn, thinking and working is, sort of social and cognitive, and we want to make sure we're addressing that as part of what we do. So that's the first reason it matters. And it implies things like designing better learning experiences actually match what we know. Turns out that a lot of what we do is information dump. And there's some reason that people seem to believe that that's going to lead to any meaningful change. And there's a very small likelihood of that happening. We know that, and yet we shouldn't. There's a second one that I'm trying to push very strongly, and that's when we're doing innovation, which if you know, Tom, think about what's happening in our organizational environment. Things are moving faster. We're talking about VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. And increasingly, we're going to have to innovate. And I say when we do research, when we do design, when we do troubleshooting, do you know the answer when you start? You don't. Otherwise, you'd bring in the person who had the answer and you'd do whatever they said. So we create teams to do this. But if you don't know the answer when you start, that's effectively learning. It's not formal learning because there isn't somebody to come in and give you the answer after you've struggled with the problems. But you're struggling with problems. And so it's informal learning. And so I suggest as well that that's an area where those people who understand learning should be playing a role as well. And I believe that should be L&D. So I think it's an opportunity. And, so on principle and then pragmatically moving to the area that's most critical for organizations to succeed is probably a pretty good strategic move as well for L&D. It takes us from a periphery, that thing that just makes sure we can perform the things we know we need to perform, to the core of success in going forward. And being the ones who facilitate innovation just strikes me as a good move for us. And I should say good morning to folks. You said good afternoon.
Of course, yes. There's we're going to have a very global audience, I suspect, for this one. Sorry, that's some UK bias showing there. It's the end of the day is in sight for me, whereas I know you're at the opposite end of the spectrum there. So if you're there as well, thank you for joining us. I know it's early for some. That was particularly interesting, out kind of bringing together those different branches of research and the different sciences coming together, because I think often in conversations I have, that's one of the stumbling blocks, is that the what is this learning science thing, because it doesn't just come from one space, of course. Once we've kind of defined what it is, though, I think the next big challenge that I often speak with people about is how to spot it, how to find it, how to kind of tell the difference between, oh, this is, evidence-backed and research-informed versus this is someone's idea that they are very good at communicating. So in your practice, how do you go about doing this, practically day to day, identifying, what's good and what's maybe not so good, and then rolling it into what you actually do?
That's a really important aspect of it. And, so I went through the PhD process. And so I got trained. I can read Academese in the original Academese, which is a language a lot like English, but deliberately obscure. And I don't expect everybody to be able to do that. That's, in fact, why my co-director of the LDA, Matt Richter, instigated creating a research checklist. And there are a number of these around. Alex Edmonds, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Anyways, Alex Edmonds from, I think, an Oxford, who's a statistician, has looked at the process of identifying flaws in these thinking. And it's really important to question people's motives, first of all. When somebody's telling you something, do they have a vested interest in this? Well, I suppose the first check I talk about is a sniff test. Does it relevant to me? Does it mean I should do anything differently? If not, you can ignore it, right? That's just loud noise in the background. But if they're telling you things like learning styles, oh, you should adapt your learning to learning styles, well, then maybe you need to go see, do they have this interest? Are they selling a learning styles instrument? Are they selling training or workshops on how to adapt? If so, well, maybe you should investigate a little further. What's the basis of their claims? And is there any counterclaim? So there's this whole process to check. Now, there is a short circuit to that. There are a number of people who have established a track record of reliably translating research to practice and calling out the bad things. And these are people like Will Thalheimer and Julie Dirksen and Patty Shank and Connie Mohammed and in the scenario space, Christy Tucker. Jane Bozarth. There are a number of people who are doing a good job of this. I like to include myself, my colleague Matt. But these are people who have looked at these claims, gone back and tracked back. I wrote a book about these myths just to help people have a quick reference guide. And in it, the problem is when you identify one of these and you want to confront somebody who wants to push it, you have to be careful how you do it, because you don't want to reinforce their belief and you don't want to challenge them on it and make them get even more entrenched. So you want to acknowledge the appeal, and you want to then say, what would be good if it were true? But you also want what would be bad if it were false. So you're opening up the door. And then you say, what does the research say? And you go and you look at the studies, and then you come back and you say, sorry, the research says there's no reason to believe this. And the most important thing, I think, is to give them an alternative. So if you say learning styles don't work, well, then how should we adapt? Well, you adapt on what you're trying to teach. If you're teaching soft skills, there's some differences than if you're trying to teach technical skills. So if you're trying to teach how to code or to use this device, it's very different than teaching how to interact with other people. And so the practice matters, the techniques matter. And to me, that really is just part of it. So you have to find credible sources. If you're in a particular situation, you may have to step back, see, has anybody talked about this? Has anybody credible looked at this and come back with the results, so I don't have to do all the research myself? If you do find something new, you may have to do the research yourself. You may have to go look at it and then look at the studies. Has it been peer reviewed? In other words, peer review is sort of the gold standard that other people have looked at it and said, yes, this is legitimate. Your methodology is good. That's appropriate to the question you're asking. You've used the right subjects. Can this transfer? So much of what we did in research was done on undergraduate students, which may be appropriate for your stuff, but that's because it was really easy to get them. If they were undergraduate psych students, you could make a requirement that they be subjects for your for your experiments. So that's what a lot of stuff done. But turns out US undergraduates don't generalize well to the rest of the world for lots of these studies they did. So you have to find out, did they use the right subjects? Did they use the right methodology? Did they use the right statistics? There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, which is why many times I find the people who you trust who have answered this. And if you end up in a situation where these people are making claims and you can't find research about it, maybe you want to get somebody in who can help you answer that question rather than stumbling around or accepting the story that somebody has a vested interest in telling you. Sorry, that was probably a longer answer than you were hoping for.
But this is exactly why people are here. Because I think that so often when, again, in these conversations that I have, whether with clients or just with colleagues in the space, this is where the trouble creeps in. There's a solid desire to be research backed, to really get our heads around this stuff, but that the stumbling blocks come in, especially around when you mention about challenging people, like when someone is sort of pushing a practice that is maybe either not backed or perhaps contradicted directly by research. How do we have that conversation? I thought that was really great advice, because I know I've certainly really struggled with that over the years of like, how do I do this without burning the relationship side of this, especially working in-house? No L&D team wants to be those people. They just walk around the business going, no, actually, I think you'll find da 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 da. And whilst they may be technically correct, no one comes to them for help, and no one ever wants to help them. So I thought actually your take on that was really, really useful.
And I'll thank you for opening the door. I'm going to step into it. One other thing I wanted to add to that is, when you're confronting people in general, and this includes, not just learning science myths or anything else, I think being prepared with a suite of different types of arguments, having the data and the research, but also have a good story, personal story. Be prepared to help them pull out their own story. One of the classic ones is, well, did you learn from going and attending an information dump seminar? Well, if you think about something you do as a hobby or a craft. How did you learn that? I bet you didn't learn by going to an information dump seminar. I bet you did practice. You did it with other people. They gave you feedback, help them. So you have those stories. have stories from the competition. That'll can grip some people, but you have to have this suite of arguments prepared and then figure out which one's going to work in this situation. Sorry, you remind me to bring that up.
No, again, I think that's really, really valuable stuff. And I think one thing I've been really trying to talk about recently is once you've got this kind of the research base, is it's conducting your own, not maybe scientific or statistically relevant studies, but experiments in the workplace to say, hey, I think I've now got an understanding. Let me try and adapt this, what is usually, like you say, very academic research to a real world application. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you go about going from kind of, that's a very interesting data point or fact or bit of research. Now, what do I do with it? What does that process look like for you?
Well, I'm going to slightly reinterpret your question for my own evil purposes. When there are great research guidelines that give you really good prescriptions to help you get a good basic initial design, but it's never going to be perfect for your situation. So you're going to have to test it and tune it. Now, you may be that you don't know, should I do X or Y? In which case you should run a little pilot and do both and say which one worked better. But even so, when you create your first draft, or even after you test this and you get a first draft, you're going to find out that it's not perfect for this particular context. And so you need to run it and find out where are still the hiccups. And you're fine tuning it for your situation. And that's really critical. If you look at what's gone from the old waterfall model of design processes to the more modern ones, and that includes Michael Allen Sim and Megan Torrance's Llama and David Merrill's Pebble in a Pond, they're all becoming iterative. Kathy Moore, action mapping, all of this, you create a initial prototype and then you test it and refine it. And that's just good practice. And yet that is so challenging to most of the existing expectations we labor under. It's like, if you build it, it is good. No, but you have to gradually make that. And, then you get into the whole strategy of how much can I do what I'm supposed to and not even tell them and get approval. And, it's easier to get forgiveness and permission, but then document that what you did was better than what you've done before. So you can get that forgiveness and move forward.
Really good stuff. So with that in mind, I wondered if we could take a look at like some common areas maybe where we struggle as an industry to get things right or to consistently deliver value, and kind of maybe what the research points us towards or how we could go about conducting some of these tests inside. And I wanted to start with forms of media. There's a couple of reasons. One, a huge number of the questions we got ahead of time, turns out, aligned to this point. How do I know whether I should be using video or audio or this image or that image or a diagram or an infographic? So from your perspective in your practice, how do you approach those questions?
I try and start. So there's a couple things, and in some of this I'll be channeling Rick Mayer's work on multimedia learning. He's a Santa Barbara researcher from UC Santa Barbara, researcher who's looked at a lot of these questions. And Ruth Clark has worked with him to write books that summarize a lot of this research. So her E-Learning and the Science of Instruction is one. She's written several different books in different ways. I know she's just finalizing the next edition of that book, and it's really good. But my first principle is, what is the fundamental property that you're needing to communicate, and what's the right media for the message? Because images and video live like this is really great for communicating context, but it's very too much contaminated by context if you're trying to communicate concepts. So then we use diagrams or animations. And when I talk animations, I mean deliberately, animated diagrams, basically, that are showing the elements and the relationships. And if it's dynamic, you're showing how they change over time. And so that said, at times we can have various reasons to do things in a different way. One can be bandwidth. While we have high bandwidth, there's a reason we can do this. There are places in the world where it's difficult to have high bandwidth. And your production capabilities may not suit it. And so there are times, Ken Burns told a wonderful story about the Civil War without using video. He had static photos and he just had them, that they were compelling, and then they zoomed in and out and did other things. But we need the right media for the message, and then we can approximate another reason we might do this is variety. This isn't doing learning styles. It's just saying that people can get bored with the same media all the time. I could have been flip and said, oh, we should use video for everything. Isn't that the easy and most engaging answer? And the answer is no. There are times, why do we have webinars where the presenter uses slides? And we can have the talking head there because maybe it's somebody we like and want to see more of. But what matters is the story they're telling through the pictures and the diagrams. Well, you and I are going to be doing a conference later this week, right, Tom? And we'll be using slides to tell a story. And you have to be careful. There's this thing that says people need to be active to learn. So how could you attend a conference or a lecture? And the real reason is because people are actually doing things in their day-to-day job. And so our lectures actually serve as a reflection opportunity. And they can then take what happens and go back. So there's a reason to have activity and then lecture and group activities and conversations as well. But you have to have that activity to make that relevant, or just pure lecture doesn't work if you don't have the linked activity. But we actually all are practitioners in the rest of our lives. So anyways, I'm getting a little bit away from the media effects, but the point is looking at them. And by the way, I will suggest there's one media we underuse, and Kevin Thorne has really become the greatest proponent of this, and it's using comics. Comics actually are very powerful because most cultures have them as a literacy. They're low bandwidth. The thought bubbles are a really great way to show the underlying thinking. We can do that in video too. I wondered what I was doing there. But in general, we can do it. And so, and they can strip away unnecessary context, but only and communicate enough, and our brains are good at filling in the rest of it if it tells a good story. So lots of reasons to do this, to consider using them as part of your repertoire. But again, they're not the only and full solution. It's making sure you use the right media for the message and being capable of changing that around. There was a tool, a comics tool, that lets you take pictures and add speech and thought bubbles to it, that lets you make little comics. And so there's just a wide variety of ways, and you want to understand what you're trying to communicate and why. So what you need for concepts is different from examples, is different perhaps from practice. But we want to make the total experience engaging and effective, and that involves sorting through the media. And again, sometimes you might say, well, I could do it with a graphic novel format, or I could use a video of this simple style because our costs are limited. And, and now there's those comic animation tools, although we overuse those, I think, because they're easy and cheap, and yet there are trade-offs. So I'm beginning to get down into the weeds and the nuances, so I'll stop there. But the point is, it's a creative exercise in choosing the right one, but start with what you're trying to communicate and why and to who.
I think that there were two things in there. One was definitely Kevin's work. When he introduced me to, Oh, no, sorry, I'm watching the wrong screen. That's fine. I thought we had a tech problem. We're fine. When Kevin introduced me to his research, it was fascinating. And it was that prime example of, I'd liked the idea. People had spoken to me about it, but I'd not quite known, how do I go to a business I'm creating content for and go, comics? We should make them for workplaces. It sounds like one of those slightly bizarro ideas, but being able to go, actually, this research has been done and blah, blah, blah. It really, going through his work really armed me to have a conversation with a business about trying something new. And I think sometimes we overlook that value in research that gets done. It's just the language that it gives us to be able to have those conversations. The other
And
thing you mentioned, oh,
I
go
would
on,
just
go for it.
say, and your learners will thank you for being creative and making it more interesting. I now return you to your scheduled statement already in progress.
This, well, the other part, and I always hesitate to open this particular treasure chest on webinars sometimes without a plan. You mentioned engagement in your piece there, and this is one of the topics that I've kind of gone from being really frustrated with it, by kind of fascinated by it, not just the word, but its use in our industry. And I wondered if you could share some of your ideas around kind of what when you say engagement, what do you refer to, and how do you define that, and kind of what backs up those definitions?
Yeah. So I'm going to take a step back. I believe learning experience design is the elegant integration of learning science with engagement. And I'd written a book on learning science. I was asked to, and I did. And then I said, and there's a number of good books about this. This includes Julie Dirkson's Design for How People Learn. I mentioned Ruth Clark's E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. We're seeing more and more. But on the engagement side, what is there? And so that's why I wrote my most recent book. And it was because I don't think there's enough out there that's good. There's some stuff on games like Karl Kopp's and my early stuff, and some others, but not specifically how do you build that into learning. And so I wrote it, but I was going to call it engagement. And my colleague Charles Jennings asked me not to, suggested it wasn't a good idea. He said, because just to your point, that it's been co-opted for so many ways by the industry. They say, oh, if we make everything video, it'll be engaging, or click to show more, that's engaging. And there's a lot of trivial senses that people have adopted that really aren't engaging. They're just, the click to show more is just a way to hide more content. It's more content dump, and pretending it's more engaging because you have to click to see it. No, there are times that makes sense cognitively, but it has to do with when you're having spatial information and you want to help people identify aspects of things and understand it. So I tried to dig into more what it really means. And I really don't like trivialization. So when people talk about gamification, they talk about adding points and having leaderboards. And that works for a competitive audience, but in general, it's contraindicated because it works for the top 10% of the people and the rest of the people get turned off. So it's not a good idea. So what I mean is intrinsic motivation. You can go to self-determination theory and looking up DC and Ryan. But what I try to do is tap into it. And I think there's two major elements. And the first one is you got to hook people. In a cognitive science, we talk about conation. That's people's intent to learn. So there's the cognitive and affective and conative. And the conation is, I am willing to expend effort in this. And we want to create that for learning, because if you don't, most of what happens, the learner may as well be coated with Teflon, to adopt an old metaphor. It's just going to slide off. So what we want is to get people, I believe, three things. They have to say, I do need this. I think we can do that pretty effectively. We also have to address, and I don't know it now. Sometimes they can believe they know it, even though they don't, and we may have to shake them up. And some of our colleagues use this deliberately. They'll ask questions at the beginning of the session, and that people think they know, and then they'll point out why they got it wrong, and then that will open people up to learning. And there's some arguments about asking quizzes at the beginning of the learning experience that people know they're going to fail. And I think there are more gentle ways to do it than that, but it has proven effective, I think, for reasons having to do with activating relevant knowledge and creating that lack. But anyways, you want people to acknowledge that they don't know it. I do need this. I don't know it now. There's a third element, by the way. And I believe this experience will change that. If they believe all three of those, they're going to go. Now, we may have lost some credibility as an industry in that respect. We've done too much click to see more, the information dumps, lots of the problems we've done. So people, when we see people paying their kids to click through courses for them, we know we're not succeeding. When people find value, they will. So we need to make it meaningful. We need to hook them in and help them know. And I believe consequences are the way to do this. You show them the consequences of having the knowledge positively, or the consequence of not having the knowledge negatively. You could do that dramatically or humorously. I have a penchant for humorously displaying this consequence of not having the knowledge, because I like that British sort of black humor, Blackadder type of stuff. But that's it. Depends on the audience, not your own personal preference. And then you need to deliver on that promise. So you've got them hooked. You've got them going, okay, I'm going to do this. Now you have to deliver. And that's landing them. If you hook them initially, you have to land them now, to use a fisher metaphor, and I'm not a fisher. So if I munch it up, you'll understand why. But we need to then make an experience that will transform them in ways that are both engaging and effective. And by the way, they should be aligned. Seymour Papert coined a term that I really like: hard fun. Trivial fun doesn't actually lead to any increase in abilities. And if it's too hard, it's too frustrating. And if you can take Csikszentmihalyi's stuff about flow, and you can take Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and they both align. They both say, if it's too frustrating, no learning happens. If it's too easy, no learning happens. Why do we have those questions that are so, the alternatives to the right answer are so obvious or stupid you can get it right without knowing anything? Waste of time. But in between is that place where you can just do it with some support, and that's where learning happens, where you're in the zone. And that changes over time. You become more capable as you gain experience. And so we need more challenge. But you need to have the right level of challenge. You need to have the context be things they recognize are relevant to them. You need to make sure they really are the appropriate, embedding the decisions they'll need to make after learning experience. In a learning experience, it goes on and on. But basically, we need to, the content has to be minimal to allow them to succeed. There's a number of things that go into it. But when we put all that together, it's both more effective from a learning perspective, and it's more engaging as well. And together you get an experience that truly is transformational in the ways we always desire and believe we should be able to deliver.
Awesome. It's a really interesting topic, as I said. So it's thank you for sharing your thinking on that. I know we've got a few more kind of pre-planned questions, but there are some cool ones coming through in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. So if we dive over to those, we can loop back to some of the ones I planned. From Bridget, what are the top neuromyths in L&D right now? What an industry we work in, where we have like a grading system for right now. What are the biggest myths we're dealing with? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would put learning styles as one that definitely continues to permeate the messaging we receive, and what not necessarily we, but our stakeholders still have this belief. So that's one that is big. I know Julie Dirksen really hates the 8-second attention span of a goldfish myth. That's completely wrong as well. It actually came from a bad interpretation of a study by a marketing agency that permeated it and got it on. That one's not accurate. Our attention is very complex, but if you've ever spent hours in a movie or a book, Marian is mentioning in the chat, how time flies. I've personally had the experience. I disappear in a book or a game or a movie and surface hours later and go, how did it get so late? Yes. So those are counters. The personality ones, the MBTI and DISC, there's theoretical reasons to avoid them, and they're psychometrically dubious as well. And almost all of anything styles tends to be promulgated by people who have a vested interest. And the only instrument that's psychometrically valid and being conducted open, and it's atheoretical, but deliberately, is the Big Five, or the so-called Ocean, and now Hexaco. And there are flaws with that as well, but it's still the best thing we have. It's just that there's no big money associated with promulgating it and leveraging it. So it's problematic, but it's still far better than anything else existing. Those three sort of are for generations is another one that bugs me. And it's not necessarily a neuromyth, but it seems to think that we can very carefully distinguish between people by certain arbitrary boundaries. And by the way, the boundaries shift depending on who you're asking. And characterizing their changes, I would suggest people from the different ages who grew up in the same environment may have more in common than people in the same age from different environments. So I just think it's an oversimplification, and our brains want to simplify things, and they like categorization. We just have to be careful about the categorizations we use that don't reflect accuracy. And most of the changes we find between, young people value certifications and old people value experience, that's just because the old people have experience, the young people don't, so they need certifications to document things. And as much as explained by that continuum of age. And back in ancient Greece, they were saying, young people don't pay any attention to tradition. So saying that now is still no different than it was back then.
No, absolutely. Well, again, it's an old joke at this point, but the classic, you won't have a calculator with you everywhere you go, so you'll need to learn this. It's like, oh, yes, imagine having a calculator with you everywhere you went. How strange would that be? These things have happened.
Why do we carry these mobile phones? Because they are the wonderful complement to our brain. They do all these things our brains don't do well.
This is exactly it. We actually got a specific question about generational difference from Matthew Kern. So, is there any evidence of a need to adopt learning solutions based on the generation of the audience? I'd like to know what science understands about how technology has impacted the brain and how training may need to change in response. Just a small, simple question there.
It's actually interesting. A number of years ago now, but still, I think it's relevant, and I'll explain why in just a second. But librarians of all people took this to heart, and both separately, they did a study in the US and the UK, and they looked at their search techniques. And you would think that people who are so-called digital natives would write better queries and be better able to interpret the results of those queries because they understand technology. And they found that that wasn't the case. There was no difference by age. They did it with young people and old people, and they found no difference. And I think the same thing now with trying to, do prompt engineering with generative AI and trying to get better searches. It's not by age, it's by your ability to do critical thinking, shows a much higher correlation with that. And that's not created by age. There was a recent book, and I can't remember, that argued that our attention span has dropped to about 45 seconds. But I, again, don't think our architecture evolves that fast, our cognitive architecture. Again, attention is complex. We have more distractions. We have better engineering for those distractions to be more effective. So notifications going off and things, and we have more devices. I have at least 3 devices here that are compelling for my attention, and the window out there as well when a bird flies by or something. So there are more distractions, but I don't think we were as distractible. We just didn't have those opportunities before. So we may be more susceptible to them, but I don't think currently there's any reason to adapt on the technology unless the audience analysis says this is a particularly technically sophisticated group and they will know a lot more about the underlying code, or this is a more critical thinking audience. And so we need to make sure that we're addressing that. The audience analysis will tell you, but it has nothing to do with generations or age automatically. That's my take at this point. And I think the science I've seen backs it up.
That's really interesting, actually. It kind of meshes. I was doing some research over the last couple of weeks specifically about TikTok and how they've got all this research about how their whole goal is keep you on the platform. And it's almost like architected for deliberate distraction. They want you to postpone any other action than go to the next video. Which is, I don't know, I became very uncomfortable reading it about how we've learned this about the brain. Now, how can we use it for the worst possible ends? Was very quickly my takeaway from that.
Well, so I go to 2 places regularly, not because I like them. In fact, I find them aversive. I've stopped going to Orlando, but I still end up going to Las Vegas a lot. And I have over the years. And the only way that I tolerate it is to go into casinos and look at how they are using our brains against us, as you say. And because I want to document that for myself and then think about how do I counter that. There you won't find any clocks. You'll find it dark. You'll find confusing navigation. You'll find lots of you can't go to the registration desk without passing the opportunity. Even at the airport, there's the opportunity to distract yourself. So I absolutely agree that their choice is to try to engineer as much, because they make money the more you watch videos. And so they want you to watch more videos, but that isn't in your best interest. And I noticed Katrina mentioned Gloria Mark's book, Attention Span. I think that was indeed the one I was referring to. Don't completely agree that one is that our attentional capacity has shifted, but the environment has shifted and we have adapted. So we are, it's not physiological adaptation, it's cognitive adaptation, which is slightly different, but I think it's accurate. And she is looking at it in appropriately scientific ways. So I do think that's good. Thank you for mentioning that, Katrina. I couldn't remember the name of the author and you brought it up for me.
Brilliant. We've got another couple of questions. So we've got a question from Sama Abdel Habi. What about the quality standards of the educational project model?
One small problem, I have no idea what the educational project model is.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one. I saw that and thought, that looks like a really interesting question. Sammy, could you drop a bit more explanation into a comment for us, and we'll see if we can cycle back round to that one, just to make sure we're answering the right question. This one's watched. Cool. So another question about specific, I don't know if theory is technically the right term to use here, but an idea maybe, is around desirable difficulty. And the idea that learning needs to be effortful, physically speaking, in terms of the brain doing the things it needs to do to actually, learn and make connections. And there's been a lot shared as well online from Lauren Waldman about this in terms of the effort and time, the physical time required for learning. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on kind of what that looks like practically, because certainly in conversations I've had, getting people to understand the idea of putting difficulty into a scenario when everyone goes, make things easier, make things quicker, and how that all kind of seems at odds. What's your thinking on it? And practically, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, we have robust research that shows that if you have to work to retrieve information, it strengthens the connections most effectively. And what you're effectively doing when you're learning is you're strengthening connections between patterns in the brain. And so it works best at the time when it's almost about to atrophy. But desirable difficulty, that's what I was talking about with challenge. It's can't be too easy that the choices, you have to make the right discrimination and you have to look at the situation and go, which is why, by the way, I like to have as the alternative the right answers, the ways people reliably go wrong, because they are going wrong for a reason. We have a little randomness in our architecture. It's evolutionarily adaptive, but that's not what you tend to see. You tend to see pattern mistakes. You ask, which is why you shouldn't just go to the experts, by the way, when you're doing your analysis up front to find out what the gaps are, because they may not have connection to what's happening in the real world. So I say you should also go to the supervisors, because they're overseeing this and they're the ones who can tell you, no matter, they come back from training, but they still make this mistake. You actually want to hear that, because that means that's what you want to build into the training, right? And you gradually want to have finer and finer discriminations, but it should be right at the limits of their ability to optimize the fastest path to learning. And as you mentioned, people say we want the fastest path to learning, but the fastest path to learning isn't fast. It's fastest because you're giving the right optimum level of challenge for this. And, so as Lauren mentions, Robert Bjork has talked about this. Anders Ericsson also talked about deliberate practice, and that's practicing the right thing for you at this particular point in time. Spacing out of the learning so that it's had time to cement, and maybe to start atrophying is better, because then you're struggling a bit more to retrieve it again. Interleaving, and Nidhi Sachdeva has done a good job of pulling together these different disparate recommendations that all are circulating around ways to introduce desirable difficulty. So practically, what does this mean? It means you want to make sure that, and probably need to test, because you'll make your first best guess, as I said, and then you'll need to test it and tune it. What's the right level of difficulty that people kind of go, it's hard fun, right? It's a struggle, but it's just the right level of struggle that I get I'm struggling, but I can succeed. I can feel that if I know what I'm doing, I will succeed. And if I don't, I won't. And that's a way to check if you know what you're doing. But you build this in and you increase the spacing over time if you have essentially finished the learning, but you want to reactivate it over time. And that's what I'm working with Elevator 9 on, is helping them figure out what's the right spacing, what's the right level of difficulty, what factors influence this. Because the more important it is, the less you want to get it wrong. And so the more practice you want. The less frequently it happens, the more non-real performance practice you need. If you do this every day or several times a day, you got to worry about different problems, like forgetting steps. And that's where Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto book came from, is using checklists for things you do all the time, and you don't want to make a mistake because you did it earlier, so you think you did it this time too. How important it is if you get it wrong, that's another issue that could affect how much practice. And I think that's sort of the difficulty. And so we're getting all these factors down to know how much practice you need, and therefore what the spacing is and how much interleaving and things. And balancing that with the human side of the equation that says we can't be pestering people all the time. We can't be annoying them too much. And what matters, and this is the research Pooja Agarwal did, we tend to have a habit of, because it's easy, of asking knowledge questions. What was it that was presented? We want to make sure you remember it. And sometimes we do stupid stuff, like asking about random stuff we haven't signaled as important, but it was just some arbitrary thing that we ask about. And that's really mean. Because there's no way they had any clue that just forced them to go back and look at it and do it again. But that just doesn't really make it lead to any behavior change. So there are knowledge questions, which we used to believe you had to make sure before you then asked the application questions. But what Pooja Agarwal's research, and she was a student of Roediger, she showed that she had 3 groups. One group did the low-level questions. One group did the low-level and high-level questions. One group just did the high-level questions. And then she looked at the results. And what we want from an organizational point is the ability to apply the high-level questions. And she found that just low-level questions didn't increase at all your ability to do the high-level questions. Low-level and high-level questions did, but not any better really than doing just the high-level questions, because they require you to retrieve it before you apply it. And that to me is really interesting, because it basically means we don't need those knowledge test questions. We can just get the application questions. So that's sort of some long-winded background to answering your question. Practically what you need to do is have people making the sorts of decisions with the knowledge that they'll have to do in the real world, and making sure that at first they're course discriminations, but they get more challenging. If you're teaching multiple things, you will interleave it. You'll have some spacing around it, and you will create your first drafts of those. But we have to be careful. I trained up a team when I was working with a company called Upside Learning to try and write better mini scenarios, because I argue that just better written multiple choice questions can do this. Obviously, mentored live practice is best. Individual mentoring doesn't scale well, and live practice can be costly if they make mistakes. So simulations are the next best step. They can be costly to develop. Branching scenarios are a really good approximation there too. They don't have the underlying models. They don't give as much replay. You can make multiple versions of them. They're a lot easier to do, and the tools these days tend to support doing this. But even a better written multiple choice question can put people in a situation and have them make a decision. But you have to be careful. That decision can't be, and this is what people too frequently do, is it a this or this or that after they do the situation they're assessing? No. Should you do this? Do this, or do this should be what you're asking them to choose between, because that's what they'll have to do in their life. And editorial soapbox, what will make a difference to your organizations going forward? I will argue most of the time is not going to be the ability to recite rote information. It can be the ability to make better decisions.
Absolutely. Right. We are down to our last 10 minutes, incredibly.
Oh, wow.
So we're gonna try and get through our last couple of questions. This one I thought was really interesting. A bunch of people asked kind of similar related ones, which is great because it means we kind of got it right in the planning. What do you think the place or link for emotion is in the design of training in the workplace?
Several things. Now, just briefly, I use emotion as a shorthand for the non-cognitive stuff, the engagement stuff, the conation stuff, motivation. And I argue that you want to get motivation right away and maintain it throughout. You want to keep anxiety low. You don't want to make it have that interferes with learning. A little bit of anxiety helps, but that comes from learning itself. You really don't need to add in much. If you need them to perform under stressful situations later, you let them master the skills first, then add in that anxiety, the stress. And you want to build their confidence such that at the end of the experience, they're confident enough, they're willing to give it a go after the learning experience. So those are the sort of emotions I mean. And the way you do that, you're going to want to, I say, open them up viscerally, emotionally before you do anything. The very first thing you do in the introduction should be to get them to make that acknowledgement, I do need this. And I don't know it already. And I believe this experience. Then you can start opening them up. That may well activate relevant knowledge. We know that cognitively leads better. But I think you need to do that first. And then you need to deliver. So your content should be minimal. And when content, I mean two things. It turns out mental models are really important for guiding us because they give us causal explanations about how the world works. They are conceptual elements and the relationship between them. And we know we can use these models to predict outcomes. We can say, if I do this, this happens. If I do that, that happens. This is better than that. I'm going to do this. That's the basis to make decisions. So you want to give them the models and you want to give them a few examples. And John Swaller's work at the University of New South Wales talks about how a few worked examples actually is, before you do practice, is better than jumping right into practice. So you give them a few examples, and what examples are is basically showing how those models get applied in a couple different contexts. So they see how they are played out before they then have to play it out themselves. And then you want to make sure that those practices they're doing, remember you were drawing out for me that they need to be deliberate practice. You need to be the right level of challenge, but they also need to be meaningful contexts that learners get and go, oh, that context. They can be fantastic. It can be set in the Wild West or out in outer space, particularly for places where you may need far transfer for particularly, more soft skills, but they have to recognize that the core decision in that problem is exactly the type of problem they're going to have to solve in the real world. So it has to be meaningful in that way. It has to be pitched at the right level of challenge. That's both emotional and cognitively appropriate. You want to, and one thing, so I've talked about opening them up emotionally to this and then maintaining their motivation. I think we should close it off at the end. So I think we need to close that emotional experience, acknowledge their effort they have expended. If we can, there's individual performance. Signify that they have achieved a new level. That's the one point. I don't mind badges. I don't like points and leaderboards, but I don't mind badges that signify and showing people their progress. So they're building that confidence and show them their progress and then signify at the end and maybe even introduce them to the community they're now a member of because of their having acquired this skill. But definitely, you always give them their further directions that they can now explore because of what they've achieved. You give them their deeper, if they care, they really got interested in this, want to know more, you give them that. But I think we need to maintain those emotional elements throughout and close it at the end. Does that?
Brilliant.
Answer the question?
That. Some really good stuff in there. And this is my last pre-planned one. And then I think there are a couple more in the chat that we'll get to if we have time. You can't run a webinar in 2024/2025 without touching on the tech space. Because there's so much of it and it's changing really, really quickly. And there's a lot of pressure in a lot of organizations to use everything, bring it in, introduce new things. This is, I think at the moment, we talk a lot about this being specifically about generative AI, but actually I think the pressure is there across a number of things, whether it's immersive technology around VR and AR, or even just a new platform, a new authoring tool. So what would your advice be to kind of take a, whether it's evidence-backed or scientific, or just your general approach to considering the new technologies that we're seeing at the moment, including Gen AI and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I've been a fan of augmenting our intellect with technology. There are certain things our brains are wonderful at. We're pattern matchers and meaning makers, and we can do this executive control, but we're really bad at remembering large amounts of arbitrary information and executing steps repeatedly, reliably. Technology is the exact opposite, which is what I've argued, way back when I was writing about mobile learning. Those devices do exactly the opposite. So I've believed in augmenting ourselves in effective ways. I've been an AI groupie for years, but that includes immersive. And I strongly believe in experimenting to make sure you understand exactly what they offer, so use them in appropriate ways. Immersive technologies are great if you really need to change scale, like much bigger cosmic scale or much smaller micro. We can create virtual worlds that are ways to explore that. Or if we need immersion in 3D worlds, like to understand the 3D relationships in a steamship or an oil refinery. But it's overkill. I had the personal experience of attending a presentation in Second Life. I was all excited. It was just a PowerPoint presentation. You could have done a webinar with it. So I'm excited about generative AI, but we have to be really careful about what it does well and what it doesn't. The fact that it will hallucinate, and talking with my colleague Marcus Bernhardt, who's an AI strategist, he talks about multiple ways that these errors can get introduced and propagate through the way these systems operate. I worry deeply right now about their environmental costs. That's increasingly becoming aware. I worry right now about IP, the fact that right now they're running on stolen IP. And so I don't trust the business models of them yet. There being large amounts of venture capital to support them. The costs that they're being used, it's still in the bubble stage. And I fear we may have the same bubble burst that we did with when our internet crashed at the end of, the internet didn't crash, but all the businesses around them crashed at the end of 1999, 2000, 2001. And yeah, I was a victim of it as well. I worry about the same thing here. So I say, again, experiment, make sure you understand, but one of the things Marcus says, and I agree, don't make any contract longer than 3 months, because you don't know where these companies are going to go. Even the big companies, we see sudden trajectory changes, new people jump into the market. And again, it's all populated. When we know what the real costs are, and when venture capital goes away and we know what they're going to have to charge us to give us this capability, then we will be able to make good predictions about who we should partner with and for what. But until then, I'm still thinking it's a bit freewheeling Wild West time, and I'd be extremely cautious. So great notion to augment us, know what the technology does well and what it doesn't, know its costs, and then make good choices. Does that help?
Love it. And that's a fantastic sort of last question, which I'll immediately follow up with another question, to be honest, because we are very nearly out of time, and I want to make sure people get the opportunity to continue learning from you. I think every time I'm on a webinar that you're doing, we have a conversation, I go away with more stuff to think about usually, rather than necessarily a pile of new knowledge, but that's just as good, to be honest. Where can people find you, read your work, and sort of continue the conversation if they want to?
I greatly appreciate that question, of course. Quinnovation.com is how you find me. If you're interested in evidence-based practices and a community around that, I suggest checking out ldaccelerator.com. That's the Learning and Development Accelerator. If you're specifically looking at how to extend practice, elevator9.com is the company I'm advising. Caveats abound. My thoughts then end up appearing in things like our conversations, my books, and such. My blog, learnlets.com, is really good if you need help sleeping at night. I post once a week, and whatever random thoughts are percolating. But I strongly believe, and not necessarily myself, but a number of people, I follow their blogs because I like to see their preliminary thinking before it emerges afterwards, because they serve as mentors to me in terms of how their thinking progresses. And that would be one argument for doing this. Shout out to Lauren in the audience who tracks a lot of the neuroscience and is throwing comments into the ward as well. And thanks, James, for mentioning the upcoming event that both Tom and I will be at. Cool. I hope that's enough for now.
I should hope so. I'm attending the LDA workshops next week in London. Actually, I'm very much looking forward to it. That's going to be an exciting week. But we are out of time, so I want to say, Clark, thank you so much for coming and sharing all this with us. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and being able to share all this with everyone is fantastic. Thank you as well to everyone who has joined us live, whether you've left a comment or not. Do take some time, reflect on this afterwards. Don't dive straight back into work emails. If you can give us 15 minutes of brain space after this, use it to contextualize everything that's been discussed. And I do need to tell you about our next event, which is on the 9th of July, and it's a little bit different. It is L&D Unleashed. Snazzy graphic is going to jump on screen in a minute. It's a half-day sort of afternoon virtual conference with real L&D leaders sharing real practical sort of examples and advice based on stuff they've actually done in their employment. So well worth joining us for that. It's already available to sign up to on LinkedIn. As always, it's totally free. It's here to share best practice with you. Again, thank you everyone so much for your time today. And until next month, we'll see you later.
Indeed. Thank you. And thank you, Tom. Great
My pleasure.
questions.